Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, the program begins now.
Well, Minister Anand, thank you for your opening remarks. You packed a lot in there, and we're all greatly enlightened, and we can see that you're coming to your new job with a tremendous passion. It's an honor to host you and everyone here at the Westin Nova Scotian Hotel in our shared home province to be in person once again to discuss the most pressing global issues of our time. My name is Andy Fillmore. I'm the Member of Parliament here in Halifax, and welcome to Halifax. I must say it's quite a privilege to be here to hold this dialogue in the presence of leading defense and security experts from around the world. And each and every delegate brings a unique perspective, a unique set of experiences to the table. And I know from my own career, which is not in defense, it's in, before politics, was in city planning, that when it comes to taking on the big challenges, there's no one person that has all the answers. Rather, each of us holds a piece of the right answer. And that's really what the Halifax Forum is all about. So I invite everybody to let that principle guide them through the important discussions that we're going to be having this weekend, So many of those discussions this weekend will focus on the ever-evolving and increasingly complex nature of the security environment. And that's what all of us here are seized with, no matter what perspective or field of expertise led us to this conference. So let's, Minister, if you're ready, let's dive right into some questions and get to know Minister Anand a little better. So now, you've become a familiar face to many people in Canada since your election in 2019. You've been on the job for about 4 months back in 2019 when the coronavirus landed on our shores and changed life as we know it. For you, as Minister of Procurement, that meant shifting focus to securing an adequate supply of vaccine for Canadians. And you rose to that challenge in a remarkable way, going beyond adequate supply and, in fact, creating one of the most admired vaccine rollout programs in the entire world. And now you've been tasked with another set of significant challenges in your new role as Canada's Minister of National Defence. Now, we're both proud Nova Scotians. You were born and raised in Kentville, me here in Halifax. So I want to ask you how growing up in Nova Scotia prepared you for this challenge, how being a Nova Scotian has shaped your view of the world and Canada's role in that world.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Andy and the organizers, for letting me come back on the stage a second time. I apologize for those who feel inundated with too much Anita. Let me just say, that, as I said in my opening remarks, being a Nova Scotian is just part and parcel of who I am. So it's difficult to separate out what exactly can be attributable to my birthplace and my home for 18 years and what other experiences would also be relevant. But all I can say is maybe just take you all back to what growing up in Nova Scotia was like in an immigrant family. My parents are both doctors. They met in Ireland, got married in England, and lived in India and Nigeria before, in the mid-1960s, they decided to immigrate to rural Nova Scotia, to a town of 5,000 people. So you can imagine that there weren't many other South Asian families in the region, and I was born then, just after that, and we're 3 daughters in our family. And I can say that growing up here was an idyllic childhood. There is nothing that I can say was wrong with that experience. And I'm a little emotional now. My mom is no longer with us, and all I can say is that I love Nova Scotia, and I love the fact that Nova Scotians welcomed my family in the mid-1960s and treated us as though we were one of their own, and we became one of their own. And this will always be my home. It's quite moving for me to think that my mom isn't any longer with us, but I will just say that this has been a wonderful home for us and has really shaped the person I am today.
Thank you, Minister. It's a wonderful story of local girl does good, and we're also proud of you here in Nova Scotia, and thanks for being such a great ambassador to our province as well. That's great. So we're here fresh off COP26, and we're sitting in Halifax, a city that's really on the front lines of climate change and sea level rise. And as you touched on in your opening, across the country on our west coast, British Columbians are responding to devastating floods and mudslides. So clearly, climate change is a serious threat to our national security at home, but also abroad. What would you say about the role of the Canadian Armed Forces in the fight against climate change, and how do you see that role evolving as the threats from climate change continue to grow more severe?
So one of the things that I think is now incontrovertible is that climate change is a reality and is giving rise to multiple different types of natural disasters across the world. And Canada obviously is no exception. And the role of the Canadian Armed Forces has been and continues to be to serve and protect our country. And I, every day, feel grateful that we have Canadian Armed Forces the incredible institution that it is, with members who, time and time again, step up to aid in times of trouble. And the situation in British Columbia is just one example. And speaking with Acting Chief of Defense Wayne Eyre, and actual soldiers on the ground, there is no hesitation in the Canadian Armed Forces to step up and assist with disaster relief, whether it is in British Columbia and floods or forest fires, or in any other type of disaster or crisis situation. And I think that speaks to the need for us to ensure that our Canadian Armed Forces are resourced appropriately, because we can now, I believe, build in to our thinking and hopefully our costing the notion that disaster relief as a result of climate change incidents is going to be a continual occurrence. And that is something that I take very seriously. Our Prime Minister takes very seriously also. Indeed, in committing to the NATO Center for Climate Change and Security and taking the lead on that is just an indication of the way in which we take climate change seriously and the need to address it through the Canadian Armed Forces at home and abroad. This is going to really call on us all as multilateral partners to address what you said in your question, that climate change is indeed a threat to our national and multilateral security.
I think your answer will edify a lot of people who are looking to the armed forces and national governments for a way forward on this file. In fact, the last time we had a Halifax International Security Forum in person in 2019, there were still Canadian Armed Forces personnel in Halifax helping to dig out from Hurricane Dorian and the terrible damage that happened right here at home. We're going to move now to an equally important and difficult topic. As is well known, over the last year, there have been numerous reports of sexual misconduct and harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. At least 11 senior CAF leaders have been implicated by allegations of misconduct. Now, this morning, you and I visited HMCS Margaret Brooke, a ship named for a heroic World War II nurse, whose commander is now a woman, Commander Nicole Robichaud. And when you asked the ship's company if they had any questions, there were only two. Both were about sexual misconduct, both from women, a sailor and an officer. You shared with them a little bit about some of the important moves on this file that you've already undertaken, including transferring the misconduct cases from to the civilian justice system out of the military justice system. What's next on this file?
So let me just take a step back for the edification of the audience in terms of what we are doing, generally speaking, on this file. I was appointed 3 weeks and 3 days ago, and yes, I'm counting every hour. But I will say that I believe that the Prime Minister appointed me in this role to address the crisis and culture in our Canadian Armed Forces head on. And I'm not a member of the military. I have not served. I do not wear the uniform. But what I bring to the table is a background in governance, 25 years as a lawyer and a law professor in understanding complex governance organizations, serving on multiple boards of directors, understanding and studying and writing articles about the need for strong governance and strong ethics in our public and private institutions. And so with that background, I believe that I am well placed to undertake the challenges relating to the crisis and culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. You asked what's next. I will say that we, although made this, what I think is a monumental announcement on November 4th, relating to transferring the cases from the military justice system to the civilian justice system, both in terms of investigation and prosecution. That is still very central to our current agenda, given that it needs to be implemented. We have announced it, but the Provost Marshal and the Director of Military Prosecutions are currently engaged with provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that the implementation occurs in an efficacious and expeditious manner. And in particular, we need to ensure at every step of the way that the survivors and the victims' interests are protected. And that is an issue that is not going to be resolved overnight, but I, as minister, will continue to advocate for a system of justice that protects the procedural fairness that victims should be entitled to, indeed in ensuring that cases relating to sexual misconduct are heard outside of the chain of command. So that is still on the agenda, and the way I like to look at it is to stand back and say, that's just one prong of a multi-pronged approach that we need to take on to address the crisis in culture. And those aren't my words, crisis in culture. Those are the words of Marie Deschamps, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote a 2015 report analyzing the situation in the Canadian Armed Forces. Other prongs, an independent reporting mechanism. We need to study the efficacy and the implementation of that type of mechanism. Indeed, we need to examine culture writ large in the Canadian Armed Forces. That is outside of cases relating to sexual misconduct, outside of investigations, but generally speaking, how can we ensure that we have an armed forces where racism, where misogyny, where discrimination are not prevalent? Yeah. We need to, for recruitment purposes, for sustainability of the armed forces, and for members themselves to have confidence in the institution, a confidence that will extend to the Canadian public at large. So the tasks before us, Andy, are manifold, but I am very determined to take them on in a way that is effective for the members of the Canadian Armed Forces themselves and for the Canadian public at large.
I could see the gratitude on the faces of not just the women who asked the questions this morning, but the entire ship's company for your empathetic response, the urgency in your response, and your victim-centered tone and footing. So I think we've got the right person in the job for this file. Thank you. Now, sticking with a similar theme, you'll remember well, and some delegates may have noticed that there was a bit of a dust-up about a month and a half ago. A bit of a dust-up. We're going to use a gentle term here. When a national newspaper in Canada, in reporting your appointment to this role, referred to you in a headline as, not by your name, but rather as, and I quote, a woman.
No, it was replaced by a woman.
Replaced by a woman. So they did soon correct it and include your name. You have a name, which is important to note. But the ordeal did speak to kind of the strange circumstances that women often face in leadership roles, like this one, where so much attention is paid to gender. Indeed, lots has been said about you being the first woman national defense minister since Kim Campbell in 1993. And I wonder if you could share with us, in your view, is it important that you're a woman? In your view, does it matter?
Well, I would hope in 2021 that we wouldn't be identifying me by my gender. I would hope that we would look at the characteristics and qualifications and qualities that the individual, regardless of gender, has. And so I will speak to some of those qualifications, or at least characteristics. And in particular, I would highlight the fact that I have been a leading expert in corporate governance and financial market regulation for 25 years. I would highlight that I've written over 100 books and articles combined. I would highlight that I led the country's vaccine procurements, leading us to be one of the top countries in the world for vaccine procurement and administration. I would hope, in a way, and I apologize for what may sound fairly immodest, I would hope that any commentators would be focusing on a person's record, regardless of their gender, because that is what I bring to the table, and I hope to be evaluated on that basis.
I hope so too. Halifax is really an excellent choice for the security forum for many reasons, and I would like to boast about many of them, but I won't. But including because the armed forces are such a very much a central part of our city here, part of our history, our culture, our identity, our economy. In fact, the armed forces employs thousands of people right here in Halifax, and the payroll in the province is closing in on $1 billion annually. It's incredible. Now, I know that you've begun your tenure as Minister of National Defence by listening to people in uniform across the country, which is an essential part of good leadership. I mentioned that you and I were at HMC Dockyard today at Margaret Brook and HMCS Halifax. We also were at 12 Wing Shearwater yesterday. About a month into the job, what are you hearing from these conversations?
The Canadian Armed Forces is an extensive institution, thousands and thousands of members across this country. And I've been in the job 3 weeks. So I need to continue to listen and learn from them. And you're right, I've been visiting bases, I've been speaking with stakeholders, I've been speaking with members of the CAF, members of the Department of National Defense. And what I'm hearing so far is there is a desire for that cultural change within the CAF. There's a desire for people to be taken on their own terms, with their own characteristics. And I've heard that from Indigenous members. I've heard that from women, men, trans, LGBTQ. And the reality is that this is the world we are living in now. And we need to ensure that our institutions across this country, the Canadian Armed Forces included, accept people from all backgrounds, regardless of personal characteristics and choices, that they feel welcome in institutions, especially when they are putting on a uniform every single day to serve our country. That's what I feel is so ironic. How could it be that people who are actually stepping up to serve our country, putting service above self, then feel discriminated against in the process of doing so? That to me seems to be egregious and something that needs to be addressed. And as I said, it is for the benefit of recruitment and retention in the Canadian Armed Forces itself, but also for Canadians at large to have confidence in the institution here in our country. And let's not forget that this is the institution that went into long-term care homes, that have fought forest fires and floods, and was over in Afghanistan, is attending peacekeeping missions all over the world. I mean, this is an incredible institution, and we need to rebuild it and protect it and make it as great as it certainly can be.
Your words in your opening remarks today resonate when you said we can't execute on our national defense strategy, strong, secure, and engaged, until we first listen to people and make sure they feel heard. So thank you. Here in Halifax, we are proud shipbuilders. We're building the next generation of Canadian warships, Arctic offshore patrol ships, Canada surface combatants. Hope we're just getting started. We'll see what comes after that. And at this point, I think it's only proper to acknowledge Peter MacKay in his role as Minister of National Defence for getting that ship procurement program started. Peter, thank you. We're having a great time in Halifax as a result, I must say. The shipbuilding is contributing mightily to the local economy. Now, I've already mentioned that the Department of National Defence employs thousands right here in Halifax, and across the country, the economic impact of the armed forces is just as powerful. So with your unique perspective coming from the Ministry of Procurement to your current role, how do you see national defense and our armed forces contributing to the domestic economic growth now and as we move into the future?
So this is a complex question, not that the other ones weren't, but, but I will say that procurement generally speaking, has the vast capacity to contribute to the growth of a country's economy. When you look at the extensive contracts that the Government of Canada executes on shipbuilding or anything else, there is capacity for economic growth there. And indeed, the National Shipbuilding Strategy is just one example of the contributions to GDP that have been made through shipbuilding contracts, including 71,000 Canadians employed as a result of that strategy. But what I think is really important when we look at government procurement, including in shipbuilding, is improving the efficiency and efficacy of the contracting process. And one of the things that I was fortunate to participate in was the actual contracts that we are negotiating and executing with our Canadian shipyards. They are complex, and indeed we involve at Public Services and Procurement, of course, we were executing contracts on behalf of D&D. So the need for synchronicity between the two departments is without question important. And I also stressed the need as Minister of PSPC for us to have certain clauses in our contracts that allow us to exit out of the contracts if there are instances of delay, unreasonable delay, or non-performance. I also suggested that we need to ensure that we have the ability to amend contracts in a more efficient manner if the supplier is not providing what is required. And so I will just say that my background in contracting and law generally was of great service to me in that role, and I hope to bring that expertise over to D&D when we are now fighting it out with our suppliers in terms of what we need for our Canadian Armed Forces. And I'll just go back to the bottom line, which is, regardless of these machinations in procurement, we really need to make sure that our Canadian Armed Forces have the supplies and the resources they need to do an effective job for our country. Yeah. And that's what I'm squarely focused on. Procurement is just one element of it, but certainly the cultural issues that we've discussed and ensuring recruitment is increasing, not decreasing, is one of the most important things I'm focused on.
And we could have a whole conversation about the community benefits that come with this kind of procurement. Here in Halifax, we have a whole cohort of Indigenous shipbuilders now that have been trained as a result of this procurement process. African Nova Scotian shipbuilders and women shipbuilders, as these people who wouldn't have had an opportunity had we not been doing these procurement processes. Well, you and I are going to have lots of opportunities to speak in Ottawa and in the House of Commons, but I'm afraid the time for your conversation with this crew has come to an end. We've been given the signal. Minister Anand, thank you very much for sharing more of yourself and more of your intention with us. We're very grateful indeed.
Well, thank you, Andy. I just thought I would just leave with a little slight bit of humor. We all could use it, I guess, especially, in an intense environment such as this. But I'll just say that in reference to your first question, when you were talking about my upbringing in Nova Scotia, etc. When I first became Minister of Public Services and Procurement, another cabinet minister who will remain unnamed said to me, "Don't worry, you are going to be in the background. Nobody is going to know who you are. You won't be doing press conferences and you won't be in the media. So rest assured you'll understand how government works well before you are in front of Canadians."
3 weeks later.
See how that worked out.
Thank you. I want to invite everyone to remain where they are if they intend to stay for the next chat. The next chat is starting right away with General Richard Clark and Mr. Nick Schifrin. So I hope you enjoy that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Nick Schifrin. I'm the Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent with PBS NewsHour, and it is my privilege to introduce General Rich Clark, Commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, previously the Director of the Strategic Plans and Policy on the Joint Staff. He commanded the 82nd Airborne. He spent 8 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, including as regimental commander, deployed during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 3 deployments to Iraq, from a military family born in Germany. West Point grad, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
Our next panel is called The Next 9/11. So let's begin there. After 20 years of war, after the recent chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, are we safer or less safe than 20 years ago?
What I talk about, Nick, is the violent extremist threat that attacked us on 9/11 still exists. It's there. We can never forget that. And I think what we have to do is be imaginative. We have to think about and continue to look at what could those threats be and make sure that we can in fact counter those threats wherever they may come from. And while Al-Qaeda was largely decimated in Afghanistan, and the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria was defeated, the threat still exists. In fact, in some ways it's metastasized, that it's actually harder to track. I think on the good side is we built an incredible coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and also in Afghanistan, and fought with some of the gentlemen that are in this audience and many of their special operations forces. I fought alongside with them, and those relationships that we built continue today and must continue. But I think the other positive side in this threat is we've also built within the U.S., and I think it extends to our allies, is an incredible partnership to look within the interagency and sharing with other nations about this threat. And for us, as we look at the threat, the most important part is the intelligence collection so we can understand and see where that threat could emanate from. So we're in some ways, we're better off because we built this. In other ways, we have to continue to see where that threat is metastasized and prioritize that threat where it is strongest.
For a while after 9/11, Special Operations Forces were deployed. It almost seemed like almost everywhere that a militant group was operating. At least that was some of the policymakers' decision. That shifted a little while ago, about 10 years ago or so. Why did the threshold change for where we deployed special operators, and what is that threshold now? Is it a little bit more precise, less about militant groups and more about groups specifically that can threaten the mainland?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I put it, we got to prioritize, and you hit exactly where we were at a certain point after 9/11. If any group raised their hand and said, I'm part of Al-Qaeda, and then subsequent, I'm part of ISIS, we generally would send special operations teams to that location to try to disrupt or defeat, and found that that's not a sustainable approach. What we have to do is work with allies and particularly indigenous partners from that region to actually defeat that threat. And try to contain it inside their borders so that it doesn't in fact grow. So we have gone to a more sustainable approach to the counter-VEO approach. And the last thing I'd say on this is a lot of times it doesn't always have to be what sometimes is thought of as a kinetic finish. It doesn't always have to be the warhead on the forehead to defeat this, but really it has to be an entire government approach, and it has to be ensuring allies and those partner nations are capable of defeating the threat.
You just got back from Somalia, one of those examples of where Special Operations Forces are doing a lot of work trying to build indigenous capacity. Let's ask about Afghanistan, though. Do you believe the Taliban is a counterterrorism partner against ISIS?
Yeah. I don't see them as a partner. I'll just be frank. I think we have an interest from the U.S. perspective that the ISIS threat that is in Afghanistan is disrupted, that it can't roost, that it could actually affect one of our nations. But I wouldn't, as we look at the Taliban, I don't think they're an entity today that should be what you just referred to as a counterterrorism partner.
And so how do we tackle ISIS in Afghanistan if we can't work with the Taliban?
As I said in the first question, we build up amazing counterterrorism capabilities over the last 20 years. Some of those capabilities can still be used in Afghanistan today. We have to work with Afghans that still remain in Afghanistan to see and sense. And then we have to work with regional allies of what they are picking up. There are still other embassies that remain in Afghanistan. There are still other intel threats. But the most important thing for us in Afghanistan is to ensure we understand the intel picture of where ISIS-K that exists there today actually is. And if it becomes such a threat that it could come back to the United States or could come to one of our allies and partners, we build up capability. We can go to where the enemy is. We've proven that time and time again with the counterterrorism forces that all of us have built up. But all of our countries have unique special operations forces that have worked, integrated together for years. And I have no doubt that we can, in fact, defeat them.
So I've only got a few minutes before I open it up because we want to speed through things. So let's pivot a little bit to great power competition. Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen recently confirmed to CNN that a small number of U.S. forces are in Taiwan. Those are special operations forces. I know you can't provide specifics, so let me ask generally. What kind of capacities do special operation forces bring to Asia and our focus on China? And what could they bring in a hypothetical scenario where Taiwan might be involved?
Nick, and it's great to have my good friend Admiral Aquilino here from the Indo-Pacific. But what SALT provides, one, we're in numerous countries throughout the Indo-Pacific today. And in many of those countries that I've been to personally, we have been for decades. We have built up relationships with partners. And so you use the word pivot. I use the word rebalance. And I use the word specific to strategic competition. And so the soft forces that have been in the Indo-Pacific really can focus on building partner capacity, looking at building resilient partners that we look at their training. We look at their interoperability to communicate internal. We look at how they could conduct medical and first aid so that we build up this resilience prior to conflict. And as one of my predecessors has said, is that you want to build a porcupine and make that porcupine so hard to swallow because you build up the resilience within that they're not even willing to take that bite. And that's really what deterrence becomes. But if they elect to take that bite, then you build up the infrastructure and the people that can resist and can actually fight back against someone. But first case, we don't want them to take the bite. We want to deter them through what we're doing. And this is the last thing I'd say on this. A really important aspect to everything that we do and all of us need to do is in the information space. Because today, so much misinformation and disinformation exist out there that sometimes it's hard to tell what the truth is. And I believe that we all need to counter that. We need to counter it appropriately and be first with the truth. But we also need to call out improper behavior that's against a rules-based order.
I don't suppose you care to share whether you believe that the Taiwanese forces are a sufficient porcupine to deter the PLA?
Yeah. Look, we'll continue to do what we need to do for the Taiwanese forces, but realize we stick within the Taiwanese Relations Act to make sure that, and what none of us hope for is any type of great power war.
And that is the effort across the region, right? I mean, it's not. I've focused on Taiwan, but it really is a regional effort to build those porcupines.
Right.
Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Just one more topic, and then I'll open it up. As you've talked about, the Special Operations Forces community has gained incredible capacity over the last 20 years, integrated much more than it was 20 years ago, and yet there are still struggles with civilian casualties. Why?
Well, first, and it's not SOF specific, but at any civilian casualty, we take the utmost within the United States to prevent that. I've personally been deployed multiple times. I've personally overseen kinetic type of strikes, and I can tell you, our people and the Joint Force, all the U.S. military does its utmost to prevent that. But war is ugly. War is kinetic, and despite our best efforts, yes, sometimes there are civilian casualties. But we continue. We learn when mistakes are made. But we do everything to prevent them, which is in accordance with all of our values and the things that we bring.
And there was one incident revealed by the New York Times recently in Baghouz, Syria in 2019, the very end of the war in ISIS. It was a strike conducted by a special operations unit. Now, it's important the audience understands that strike is done within Central Command, who was fighting the war in Syria, and the investigation is in Central Command. But the experts I asked about recently, about that strike in particular, pointed out that there's a fear among these military watchers that special operations forces are too quick to call in airstrikes. So are they too quick to call in airstrikes?
Categorically, no. And categorically, no. We're taking, but every situation is different. And you can't compare one strike to another strike. But what I would say is that, no, we're not too quick, and we are deliberate. And like every, as you highlighted the Baghouz strike, we're going to pick it apart. We're going to continue to learn from those things, and we're going to make sure that the entire force understands what took place and share those best practices and where there are shortfalls.
And why are you so confident that no, you're not too quick, or Special Operations Forces units are not too quick to call in airstrikes? What are, just to share a little bit about what reassurance or what call it TTPs, I guess, what aspects of the tactics allow you to say so surely that we're not too quick?
Because there's structure in place with commanders that take it by a step-by-step process. And truthfully, I just witnessed this recently, where you're looking at where the potential, what the potential strike is. You're talking about what type of effects you're trying to achieve, what type of munitions you're going to use. Those are specifically picked out to minimize collateral damage or civilian casualties. And then eventually it's a commander in that loop who in fact makes that decision to do so. And one best practice that we've actually implemented and will continue to is you actually also have a red team that is watching that strike, that is questioning, is this the right thing to do, just to make sure that everyone is looking at it through, you don't get, what you try to do is avoid a confirmation bias or something. So having a red team, having an outside independent look is something that is being implemented for all these strikes.
Good. We've got only 5 minutes, so maybe we can get a couple questions in. Let me turn to this side first. I saw that hand first, and then I'll come back over to this side, promise.
Thank you. Patrick Tucker from Defense One. Good to see you, General. In light of the retrograde in Afghanistan, the strategy that the U.S. military, I'm told, is relying on for counterterrorism targets in Afghanistan and elsewhere is called over-the-horizon capability, which, to my understanding, means limited forward observers, limited JTACs on the ground. Can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs of over-the-horizon strike capability versus the more permissive environment that you had? What should the public expect in terms of how effective over the horizon can be against counterterrorism targets? Thank you.
No, it's fair question. It's going to be harder. Anytime you have physical presence on the ground, it stimulates the enemy forces. You see and sense you're with partner forces. So it is going to be harder. However, as I spoke about previously, the unique capabilities that we built with airborne unmanned aerial vehicles, presence with Afghan partners, the ability to talk with them and continue to work with allies, it's going to be what we're going to continue to do. And while hard, we've done hard, and we can do hard, and we're going to continue to persist.
Let me look on this side of the room. Sort of kind of in the middle with the gray mask there.
Hi, my name is Matthias Gebauer. I work for German magazine Der Spiegel. General, you were talking about the strategy which has also been valid for Afghanistan to train with local partners. And that's what the US military did. They built up a strong network of special forces, Afghan special forces called commandos. From your point of view, in the aftermath of the fall of Kabul and the whole country, how could it happen that especially these forces played no role standing up against the Taliban? They just vanished. And maybe also the question, where did all these men go? Did you follow up where your partners went, or where did they vanish to? Thank you.
No, thanks. Some of those partners left Afghanistan as part of the retrograde, but many of them did remain and remain in Afghanistan. And it goes back to the earlier panel and the discussion of the connection of the military and building the military so it has a connection to the government. And then once the government of Afghanistan that was in support of all of those forces fell apart, where there's then no further logistics, no further pay, no further weapons or ammunition coming to them. Without that hope and without that backbone, they did not resist against the Taliban after it was evident that it was a losing proposition.
Just as a follow-up, do you believe that the fall of the Afghan military questions the very ability of the United States to create a sustainable indigenous force elsewhere?
No, I don't, because I think, but you have to tie in, the whole aspect, and I think we should reflect on what we built and use the lessons learned for what we build in the future, depending upon the security needs of that country and the sustainability of those partner forces that we are part of. And we have to make sure that we honestly look at that.
I think we have time for one more. I think we got one hand there, yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, General. My name is Carlos Vecchio, an ambassador from Venezuela in the United States. So I would like to ask you the following, General. In your view, in your opinion, what is the main threat against the United States coming from Latin America or from this hemisphere? You know, take into account the presence of China, Russia, and of course the undermining of democracy in some of the countries in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. And I recently had the opportunity to go down to Colombia and spend some time down there with our special operations forces in the region who are doing a tremendous job. From a threat perspective, military always looks at most likely and most dangerous. And I do, from a Special Operations Command perspective, always look at I look at the most likely as some type of violent extremist attack inside the United States. And some of that could be directed and by the violent extremists, but sometimes, as we've seen, it could actually just be inspired. And I think it's really important that all of us look at what type of attacks and those threats. So I do still see that as the most likely. I do think that the most dangerous is the long-term type of conflict that we could have with a strategic competitor if, in fact, some type of misstep or mistake is made that puts us into that. And that's what we're trying to prevent each and every day with our forces that are resident, today, while we're sitting here, we have forces in over 70 countries that are exactly out there to be able to look at that and see what the threats are and work with every single one of our allies here. And I think that's an important step in preventing both of those type of attacks. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you, and thanks to you, General Rich Clark. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Nick. Good seeing you.